The will reading was on a Tuesday. It was held in a lawyer's office on the second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. My grandmother's favorite sweater was still folded on the chair in her bedroom at home. Her coffee mug was still on the counter, and her lawyer was sitting across a mahogany desk from our family, reading a document she had signed 11 years earlier. I was 30 years old. I had been grieving for 3 weeks, and I had no idea that the worst part of losing my grandmother wasn't losing her. It was finding out what she'd decided about me before I was old enough to vote. My name is Nora Callahan, and I want to tell you about the 11 years I spent being loved by a woman who had already written me out of her will at 19 years old, while my sister sat at every holiday dinner, knowing exactly what was in that document, and never said a word. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quiet ones finally get to speak. If you have ever loved someone completely, only to find out that love had a different set of books running underneath it, you already know the particular weight of what I'm about to describe. Pull up a chair, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And stay with me, because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Let me tell you about my grandmother before I tell you what she did. Because none of this makes sense and all of it makes sense if you understand who Nora Callahan was to me. She was the kind of woman who remembered how you took your coffee, even if she hadn't seen you in 2 years. She kept a spiral notebook by her phone, with the names of everyone she cared about, and the small details of their lives, who had a job interview coming up, whose kid had started kindergarten, who was having a hard month. She called it her prayer list. I called it proof that love is mostly just paying attention. I was the grandchild who lived closest, 20 minutes from her house in Claremont, a beige 2-story with rose bushes she tended like they were children. I drove her to chemotherapy the first time. She held my hand in the waiting room and told me not to look so pale, that she was the one with cancer and I needed to pull it together. I laughed. She laughed. And for 3 years after that I drove her every third Thursday. My sister Meg lived 4 hours away in Portland. She came at Christmas and sometimes Easter. She sent flowers on my grandmother's birthday. Nice flowers, the kind that come in a box. And I told myself the difference didn't matter. That love isn't a competition. That showing up isn't a transaction. I believed that. I want you to know I genuinely believed it. Right up until a Tuesday in a lawyer's office, when I found out that someone had been keeping score all along. And the score was not what I thought. The lawyer's name was Gerald Finch. He was a small man in a large chair, and he read with the flat precision of someone who had delivered hard news. So many times, it had stopped being news to him. There were 6 of us in the room. My parents, my Aunt Ruth, my cousin Daniel, me, and Meg. Meg was sitting to my left. She was wearing my grandmother's favorite color, navy blue. I had noticed it when she walked in and thought, she remembered. I thought it was grief. Gerald Finch cleared his throat and began. The house went to my Aunt Ruth, which made sense. She was the oldest and had been named co-executor years ago. There were small bequests to a church, a local shelter, a neighbor who'd mowed her lawn for a decade. And then Gerald Finch got to the grandchildren. To my granddaughter Margaret and Callahan, he read, I leave the entirety of my personal savings, my jewelry collection including the pearl earrings she always admired, and the sum of $240,000. I heard my mother make a small sound. To my granddaughter Nora Beth Callahan. I straightened. I folded my hands. I waited. I leave my love and my hope that she finds her way. That was it. That was the sentence. My love and my hope that she finds her way. Gerald Finch kept reading. The room kept breathing. And I sat there with 11 years of Thursday chemotherapy drives, folded in my lap like a receipt no one had asked for. I didn't move. I'm a middle school art teacher. I have spent 12 years keeping a steady face in front of 30 children, while managing everything from meltdowns to emergencies. My face didn't break. But I turned slowly, and I looked at my sister. And Meg was not surprised. Not even a little. Her face was doing something careful and controlled. The face of someone managing a reaction they'd had time to prepare. Not the face of someone hearing something for the first time. And I knew the way you know when a patient's vitals are wrong. Before the machine says anything. I knew before I could explain how I knew. She had read that document before today. The meeting wrapped in 20 minutes. Aunt Ruth stayed to sign papers. My parents were quiet in a way I didn't have words for yet. And Meg moved quickly toward the door, with the specific efficiency of someone who wants to be in her car. Before anyone asks her a question, I said her name. Just her name. Meg. She stopped. She turned. And she said, before I'd asked anything, Grandma made her own choices, Nora. We have to respect that. We have to respect that. Not I'm so sorry. Not I had no idea. Not even the silence of someone genuinely blindsided. Just a preloaded answer. The answer you prepare. When you've known a question is coming. For a very long time, I watched her walk out to the parking lot. I watched her get in her car. And I stood on the sidewalk outside Gerald Finch's office, in the November cold, and I let myself feel the full shape of what had just happened. My grandmother had written me out of her will when I was 19 years old. For 11 years I had driven her to chemotherapy, sat with her through the bad days and the good ones, built the closest thing I'd ever had to an unconditional relationship. And my sister had known the whole time. The question wasn't why my grandmother had done it. The question, the one that would consume the next 6 months of my life, was what Meg had known, when she had known it, and how she had sat across from me at 11 years of holiday dinners, and said absolutely nothing. I want to pause here for just a second, because I know some of you are already typing in the comments. Why would she stay quiet? What did she get out of it? Those are the right questions, and I'm going to answer every one of them. But first I need you to understand the 11 years. Because the money is almost the least interesting part of this story. What Meg took from me wasn't $240,000. What she took was the chance to grieve my grandmother clean. Stay with me. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table. And I did what I do when something doesn't make sense. I made a list. Not of grievances. Of facts. Fact. The will was dated 11 years ago. I was 19. Fact. Meg was 23. Fact. The will had been in place unchanged through my grandmother's entire illness. Fact. Meg showed no surprise today. I stared at the list for a long time. Then I called Aunt Ruth. Ruth is 71 years old and has no patience for small talk or family mythology. She answered on the second ring, and when I told her what I was thinking, she was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, I was wondering when you were going to call me, Nora. Ruth told me the story in the careful way of someone who had been carrying it, and had been waiting maybe for permission to set it down. When I was 19, my grandmother had gone through something. Not a health scare that came later. Something personal. A conflict. Apparently I had missed a family gathering. A significant one, my grandfather's memorial service, the first anniversary of his passing. I had missed it because I was 19 and stupid, and in the middle of a terrible relationship with a boy, who had convinced me that his needs were always the emergency. I had called at the last minute. I had not shown up. My grandmother had been devastated. Not angry devastated. The quiet permanent kind of hurt. That doesn't announce itself, but simply rearranges something inside you that never quite goes back. She had updated the will 3 weeks later. I sat with that for a long time. I was 19. I was in a bad situation I didn't have language for yet. I had made a terrible choice on a terrible day. And my grandmother had made a permanent decision about my character, based on the worst version of me, and never told me. For 11 years, she let me drive her to chemotherapy. Let me sit with her through the fear and the nausea and the relief. Let me believe I was her person. And the whole time the will said otherwise. I am not going to tell you my grandmother was a villain. I don't believe that. I think she was a woman who got hurt, and made a legal document out of her pain. And then, here is the part one had to sit with for months. Kept loving me anyway. I think she changed her mind about me somewhere in those 11 years. I think the Thursday drives did matter. I think she forgot the will existed, or told herself she'd change it, or didn't know how to bring it up. People are complicated. Grief is complicated. 11 years is a long time. But here is what is not complicated. My sister knew. Meg had been named in the original will. Meg had been told, at 23, old enough to understand exactly what it meant. And Meg had made a choice. Not to tell me. Not once. Not in 11 years. Not when I drove to Claremont every third Thursday. Not when I sat in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning. Not when I stood at our grandmother's bedside in the last week and held her hand and told her she didn't have to be afraid. Meg had known. And Meg had let me do all of it. With a smile on her face and flowers sent in a box from Portland. That is not a family misunderstanding. That is a choice. Made 11 years in a row. I need to say something here. Because I know exactly where some of you are. Maybe you're thinking, well, it wasn't Meg's place to tell her. It wasn't her responsibility. And I want to sit with that for a second because I thought about it too. But here's what I keep coming back to. The year I sat in a chemotherapy waiting room, holding my grandmother's insurance paperwork in a folder I'd organized myself, Meg called me from Portland to tell me about a new restaurant she'd found. We talked for 45 minutes. She did not mention the will. At some point, silence stops being neutral. At some point, you are not just not telling. You are watching. 6 months after the will reading, I got a phone call from Meg. She was planning to sell some of the jewelry. The pearl earrings, a bracelet, a few pieces she said she didn't wear. She wanted to know if I wanted anything. She said it casually, the way you offer leftovers. Did I want anything? I told her I needed to think about it. And then I called Aunt Ruth again. Ruth, it turned out, had been thinking too. Because Ruth, like me, had been paying attention. And Ruth had found something. In the last year of my grandmother's life, when she was in and out of good days and bad days, and the kind of lucid clarity that comes sometimes near the end, she had spoken to Ruth. Not about the will directly, but about me. She had told Ruth that Nora was the one who showed up. That she was grateful. That she didn't know how to say it, but she was grateful. And Ruth, careful, precise Aunt Ruth, had written it down. In a notebook she kept by her own phone. Just like my grandmother used to do. She had the date. She had the exact words. And she had been waiting to see if I was going to need them. I went to see a lawyer. Not because I thought I could overturn the will. Couldn't, and I didn't try. But because I needed someone to tell me what my options actually were. What the truth actually was. What I was actually owed, not in money, but in clarity. What I learned is that in cases of clear changed intent, statements made by the deceased to witnesses, documented, dated, and substantiated, there are sometimes grounds to bring a claim of failure to reflect intent. It's not a guaranteed path. It's not even a common one, but it exists. For people who showed up. Who kept records without knowing they were records. Who were witnessed, noted, dated by someone like Ruth. Who understood that love needs documentation sometimes. Because families do not always tell the truth on their own. I did not go to court. But I did send Meg a letter. Through my lawyer. Carefully worded. Containing Ruth's notes, the dates, the documented statements. And a single question. Given what Grandma said in the last year of her life, are you sure you want to keep everything? Meg called me 3 days later. She did not call to yell. She called in the voice of someone who had been caught, and was trying to decide how to make that someone else's fault. She said the will was legal. I said I knew. She said Grandma had made her choices. I said I knew that too. She said, and I want you to hear this one. She said, I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hurt you. 11 years. 11 years of Thursday chemotherapy drives. And the reason she'd stayed quiet was that she hadn't wanted to hurt me. I let that sit in the phone line between us for a long moment. And then I said very quietly, Meg, I'm going to tell you something that's true. You let me spend 11 years loving someone, while you held information that changed the shape of that relationship. That wasn't protecting me. That was protecting your inheritance. And we both know the difference. She didn't answer. I told her I wasn't going to fight her for the money. That it would cost more than it was worth and prove less than I needed. That I was going to do exactly what I'd always done. Handle things myself, build what I needed, trust the people who showed up. But I told her one more thing. I told her about the nursing scholarship I wasn't naming after myself. About the donation I'd made. Not from the inheritance, which was nothing. But from the money I had saved myself over 12 years of teaching. Not 240,000. Something smaller. But mine. Every dollar of it. given to a grief counseling program at a children's hospital. In my grandmother's name, because whatever else she was a woman who believed in paying attention to people. And I had learned that from her directly. Every third Thursday, for 11 years, I told Meg she could keep the pearl earrings. And I hung up. There is something I need to say before I wrap this up, because I think some of you came to this story waiting for a bigger explosion, a courtroom, a public humiliation, a reversal. And I understand that impulse. I had it too. But here's what I learned from 11 years of watching someone I loved move through the last chapter of her life. The loudest revenge is usually the most expensive one. And the most expensive things are the ones that cost you your peace. Meg kept $240,000. And a jewelry box. And a story she has to tell herself every time she wears those earrings. I kept the Thursdays. I kept Ruth's notebook. I kept the proof, in my grandmother's own recorded words, that the last version of me she knew was the one she was grateful for. You cannot put a legal dollar amount on being the person someone was glad knew them at the end, but if you could, I think it would be worth considerably more than the will. If you are the one who shows up, the one who drives the Thursday appointments and organizes the paperwork and stays late and never asks for the receipt, I want you to hear this. You are not invisible, even when the documents say otherwise. Even when the will gets read and your name comes with hope instead of money. Even when the person sitting next to you knew and chose the easier thing for 11 years in a row. You are not invisible. The people you showed up for, they knew. And the ones worth keeping in your life will be Ruth. The ones who write it down. The ones who say, I was wondering when you were going to call. Keep showing up. Just be more careful about who you show up for. And put your love where it comes back. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment. Tell me your version. Tell me about the will, the house, the inheritance that went sideways, or just the holiday where you finally understood what you were worth to certain people. I read every single one. Subscribe so you're here for the next story, because next week we're going into something I have never covered before. A woman who discovered her mother had been hiding an entire second family for 22 years, and found out at a funeral. It is the most requested story I've ever received, and it will not disappoint. I'll see you then.